Between 1980 and 1985, the Dragon magazine, at that time published by TSR, came out with an annual magazine called Best of the Dragon, and the first one contained material from the Strategic Review, which predated the Dragon and the Dragon Volumes 1 and 2, and then the second one, which has the same dragon on the cover, different color, has the first 4 years of the Dragon. We've got then moving to, let's see, I had these out of order here. Thereafter, just says selected from out-of-print issues of the Dragon magazine for Volume 3, but they came out annually, so this is July of '83, Volume 3 of the Best of the Dragon. Volume 4 of the Best of the Dragon came out in May of '85, and Volume 5 of the Best of the Dragon came out in May of '86. To my knowledge, and I'm far, far, far from an expert on this, but to my knowledge, there were no more of these compilations at the time, that this is the complete set of them, volumes 1 through 5. I have long wanted to figure out a way to present some of the material here, and I've decided to focus on, in this video, just what is in the first volume, which contains, again, from the Strategic Review, and then the Dragon Volumes 1 and 2. If there's interest in the video, I will do other videos on maybe one per volume. I don't know. It depends how much interest there is on this. I am not going to be able to, nor probably would it be interesting, to read everything in here, but rather just to call some attention to some of the highlights in it, and perhaps this is something that you would like to track down yourself or just be interested in the material as I can present it in the length of, a reasonable length of a video. The couple of points on this that I'm also going to be showing you some of the ads for a variety of reasons, just because it's really, well, I find it very interesting to see not only what was being offered, just the range of material. And in here, as you'll see, obviously, if you know the history of D&D, you'll see that there's a lot of wargaming material, a lot of minis that come in as the ads. Now, I would assume that the ads are for this specific compilation volume, that the ads are not also, I don't think the Strategic Review really had advertising like this. I've only seen a few copies of it. We have the publisher statement here, and this is, again, at this time, published by TSR Periodicals, a division of TSR Hobbies in Lake Geneva. It says all the material herein has been published previously, copyrighted between 1975, 6, 7, and 78. And then, again, this was this compilation, copyrighted 1980. We have a letter from the editor, Tim Kask, and an indication of who this volume is dedicated to. The statement here in part reads, "The material contained in this volume in some ways could be used as a chart of the history of D&D, as well as the history of the Dragon. The material ranges from the first issue of the Strategic Review, presented in the spring of '75, to the Dragon 14, published in May of '78. Just as the earliest material deals with the earliest simpler forms of D&D, pre-Blackmore and other supplements, some even pre-Greyhawk, the material was first published by us in the earlier, simpler days of TSR, the good old Strategic Review, and the earlier days of the fledgling The Dragon." It's interesting, of course, that even in 1980, there's a look back toward the good old days. The D&D material contained herein will be invaluable to the beginner seeking to better understand the philosophy and background of the game, as well as to the more experienced gamer seeking even deeper immersion into an understanding of the game. Further, there are treatments on design and play aspects that all D&Ders can benefit from. Some of the material in this volume can be recognized as the prototype of material that was later incorporated into the game, or further further refined into the tenets of AD&D. Keep in mind that these articles are unchanged from the way they first saw print, and in some cases have therefore been superseded or transmorgified. Simple words fail to express the pleasure I feel in answering the demand for this magazine. I'm delighted to present it to you. We start with a design and designers forum that is an article written by Gary Gygax on the concepts of spatial, temporal, and physical relationships in D&D. And I have to say, as a disclaimer here, I've read most of what is in here. I can't go through in such detail every article. This one happens to be pretty interesting. Some are more interesting than others. I can't go through every article. It'd just be too long. So I'm going to, by necessity, be skipping things over that some of you wish I wouldn't, and I'm sorry for that. And this is one of them. We have an article, How Green Was My Mutant? The Appearance of Humanoids in Metamorphosis Alpha. And some very basic tables here to roll on to create some type of mutant. More on Metamorphosis Alpha, which I'm going to skip over. And here we have a section, Hints for D&D Judges. Elsewhere in the magazine, as it gets later on, this is presumably from Strategic Review. It doesn't actually say in the compilation here which is from what, but it's at the very beginning of this compilation, so I'm assuming it is still from Strategic Review, that there are references to Dungeon Masters here in this volume, Dungeon Master being one word, and here at the beginning, in the beginning articles, they're referred to as judges. And we have a series of articles here about situating campaigns and situating sessions. Everything pretty much actually is referred to as a campaign, I believe, in here. Situating them in a larger environment, even if the party and the adventure at the table at that time is not going to be dealing with specifically going into the town or necessarily interacting with a town. There's some examples of how to do this and an explanation of why it's important to do that, and it is basically to give a larger locale, to create a map, even bodies of water outside, geographical features, to make it a place of origin for your characters, and to have places in the town like bars and a magic shop perhaps that people can return to. The wilderness is interesting. The comment here that starts out probably one of the main things that keeps D&D judges from turning their games from a good dungeon into an exciting campaign is the lack of a wilderness area. Again, the concept that something shouldn't just be plopped down, and that if you're going to have a castle or a dungeon here, it needs to have a history, a locale, a reason for being. And here there's a comment that when judges of D&D, new and old alike, think of an entrance to dungeons, the greater percentage think of an old ruined castle somewhere outside their town. And many of this same group have the mistaken impression that there's only one entrance to every dungeon. Both these ideas are wrong. True, the famous game of Gary Gygax and Bob Kuntz is built around and under Greyhawk Castle, but this is far from being the only entrance. And he says, besides the castle, I've discovered an entrance through an old dry cistern, and another entrance that is under a pool of quicksand, and even an entrance in a simple hole in the ground. So he's talking about different ways to get into a castle, and also to play out some friendly little traps spread throughout the dungeon. They don't always need to be harmful, and giving some examples of what could be in a trap. A little comment here, it is always fun to create and use treasure that throws a party of adventurers into indecision. Personal favorite is monster gems. Monster gems are magical gems worth 500 gold pieces each. They are magical in the fact that when commanded, the gem will turn into a monster. The trouble is that the owner might get anything from a kobold to a red dragon. Now you have to decide whether giving up 500 gold pieces is worth the chance of getting that. Creation of a multi-level town, and by multi-level I mean places where different classes of people are living and different areas, the marketplace area. Further discussion of the taking a step back from dungeon creation to focus on, well, as the author says, when designing a dungeon, before you begin madly scattering chutes, monsters, and secret doors, take a moment to figure out what it's all for. The history of the dungeon, where it is located, what it looks like, the builder's occupation, social standing, alignment, and personality, will dictate what is going on and how the dungeon has been designed, and actual planning of the dungeon in terms of its location and how much of it is underground and exactly where it is, more so than just jumping right into the design of it. Some fairly basic, and I shouldn't say fairly basic, I mean, again, we're talking about, this is 1975, I mean, this was like primary source material at the time. So fairly basic is all relative, but here are, so I'll try to stop saying that. There are tables here for designing wilderness areas with different features and gradations of terrain. Some more, I just skipped over this, but some more of the, for John Carter of Mars, an article about some of the Martian cities there, and an advertisement for a very large campaign map product. Dragons by Dragontooth, the most exciting and original fantasy figures in 25mm scale. An amusing article, How Heavy is My Giant? And what's amusing about this article is there's a chart here that tells you if your giant is a certain amount of feet, how much he weighs, and what his chest size is, his feet size, his torso length. What's amusing about the article is the end of the article here is the actual formula that says the refined formula for those of you who wish to find out the weight and size of a larger giant. This is the formula we used, and it goes through the entire formula here with an example of what you came up with, and I think an enterprising math teacher in the right math class could give that as a student example, which would be pretty funny. There's an article here on Tolkien in Dungeons and Dragons, and a pretty strong defense. I mean, even in bold here, D&D was not in bold, was not written to recreate or in any collective way simulate the Tolkien world here, even though some of the same beings were included because it was recognized that Tolkien made some impressions upon the fantasy literary world which were worth including in D&D, but not to the extent of basing the game system around them. This is left up to separate judges. But in doing so, they excommunicate themselves from the actual D&D system. As I stated earlier, we support creative imagination, but we also support the premise of D&D. Those who base their games around a single work, such as Lord of the Rings, are playing a campaign based around Middle-earth. And since D&D was not written to create a basis for one world, it is thus not strict D&D. So a pretty strong defense of the separateness of this. Players must remember also that elves, dwarves, and similar creatures were around before Tolkien took to the field, and determination of advancement, etc., are left to the separate authors or judges as the case may arise. And here, finally, what I'm saying is that for a role-playing, continuous adventuring world, Tolkien's does not fit well with the D&D game style. Thus, difficulties will always be found when one attempts to combine D&D and Tolkien's Middle-earth into one. This is an amusing article. Notes from a semi-successful D&D player, James Ward. This, he says, I have been traveling around dungeons for a considerable period of time now, and in that time I have thought up and copied many little tricks that have gotten me out of some tight spots. I'm setting them down in the hope that some will profit by them. And he then, in this article, goes on to discuss various spells and things that he has created such that he can get out of anything that a judge might throw at him. So the first is the creation of a continual light wand. This small baton will give you heatless light. It's much better than a torch because you can throw them into an unknown room and they don't go out. It's only a second level spell, so it's easy to make. It tells you where you can keep it. The second idea needs the 4th level growth plant spell and a plant control potion. When I have the potion, I carry around a small potted rose plant in the dungeon. If the situation arises where I am trapped in one of those ever-popular dead ends and the monster is bearing down on me, the rosebush gets enlarged into a wall, and I order it to attack the monster! ! It is truly gratifying to see the effects of those thorns on the hide of the monster. Everyone knows the usefulness of the 10-foot pole in many tight places. The use of a 5-foot steel rod is even more useful in those tight places. You can hang from it and it will not break like the wooden version. It is great for the stopping of those sliding walls. Last but certainly not least, it is its use as a lever of great power. And he goes on to talk about Vampires and garlic. A polymorph spell can be one of the best double attack spells known if you use it right. For instance, if a cockatrice attacks and you succeed in turning it into a snail, you should capture the snail. Then in the next battle, the snail is thrown in first with a dispel magic following it. The snail becomes a cockatrice, and if it survives the transformation, it fights your battle for you. Then there is the poison on the dagger trick, which every judge is always trying to stop. I have been told that poisons evaporate, poisons exposed to the air lose their effectiveness, or, the most useful of all, in your area there is no poison strong enough to kill the things you want. I suggest to all you players, and especially the magic users that can only use daggers, that any amount of money and effort spent in the procuring of a really effective poison is worth it. I spent over 90,000 gold and haven't regretted a copper piece of it. And he sort of ends by saying that all you magic users out there should devote some time and effort to the creation of new spells. It requires money and time, but when you have succeeded, you have a sellable item in the form of a spell only you have. I made a 4th level cold ray that really works great against all creatures and especially those fire types. I particularly like what it does to red dragons. The list of possible spells to be made is endless, with the only limitation being your imagination. Next, we come to a Gygax authored article, The Meaning of Law and Chaos, and their relationships to good and evil, pointing out that you can... he says there's considerable confusion in that most dungeon masters construe the terms chaotic and evil to mean the same thing, just as they define lawful and good to mean the same. This is not surprising, he says, but it's also not true, and he goes into the reasons why. And there is a listing here, pretty useful actually for the soloist perhaps, in terms of just descriptors of some adjectives describing lawful, like reliable, principled, righteous, regulation, methodical, and chaos, unruly, confusion, turmoil, irregular, etc., as well as for good and evil, harmless, friendly, kind, honest, sincere, helpful, or unfit, mischievous, unpleasant, dishonest, bad, injurious, etc. And then there's this chart here that places the classification of monsters and creatures within this rubric. So, for example, the lawful good up here, you've got the paladin, and then various other monsters or creatures that would appear under that category. Now, some are listed twice, so we've got giants here, here, and here. That's 3 times for giants. We have, for example, in the bottom right, or excuse me, the bottom left quadrant here, the lawful evil, the vampire, and liches, mummies, ogres, etc. And then in this quadrant here, we have the chaotic good. So we have the elves and sprites, so giants are here as well, gnomes. And then finally in this quadrant here, we have the chaotic evil epitomized by the demons and see some trolls. The center here is meant to be the neutral, and so we have all elementals and other objects. And then there's further discussion about that. There's an article here on the origins of D&D, which I'm not going to go over in detail, but this material is, I think, fairly well known to those who follow the history of D&D, and if you're interested in that, there's also a lot more material on the web in video format and written format about that, the development of the chainmail rule books and the fantasy supplement therein and how that came into D&D. There is an article on D&D is only as good as the DM by Gary Gygax. Successful play of D&D is a blend of desire, skill, and luck. Desire is often initiated by actually participating in a game, and it is absolutely a reflection of the referee's ability to maintain an interesting and challenging game. Skill is a blend of knowledge of the rules and game background as applied to the particular game circumstances favored by the referee. Memory or recall is often a skill function. Luck is the least important of the 3, but it is a factor in successful play nonetheless. There's some advice here to the DMs about considerations for not just putting things in for the sake of it. So for example, he's asking DMs to consider, is magic actually quite scarce in your dungeon? It should be. Likewise, treasure should be proportionate both to the levels of the dungeon and the monsters guarding them. That you must, as a DM, have absolute disinterest in if one of your favorite players puts himself in a position where he's about to be killed, let the dice tell the story and kill him nevertheless. He says this is not to say that you should never temper chance with a bit of, quote, divine intervention, but helping players should be a rare act on the referee's part, and the action should only be taken when fate seems to have unjustly condemned an otherwise good player. He's suggesting that you create personas for the inhabitants of the dungeon and not just have them there. Same is true for wandering monsters, he says. As the article continues, he says, when players no longer have reams of goodies at their fingertips, they must use their abilities instead. And as you will have made your dungeons and wildernesses far more difficult and demanding, it will require considerable skill, imagination, and intellectual exercise to actually gain from the course of an adventure. And then he goes on to talk about not attaining too high a level and requiring players to work for their experience to earn their treasure. And if that is the case, interest will remain in the game. There's an article here on the magic system pointing out that the magic in chainmail was fairly brief because it was limited to the concept of tabletop miniatures battles. But the same is not true of D&D, and he talks about the types of magic systems that there are, and giving, in fact, a little bit of the history of the derivation of where these things came from in other literature, such as the conjuration with paraphernalia as an adjunct as used in Shakespeare's Macbeth, the relatively short spoken spell as in Finnish mythology or found in the superb fantasy of Jack Vance, and continuing on with some of the literary foundations of what was D&D magic system. He talks about the four basic parts of magic: the verbal spell, the somatic or physical movement required for the conjuration, the psychic or mental attitude necessary to cast the spell, and the material adjuncts by which the spell can be completed. To cite an obvious example, water to raise a water elemental. Interesting to think about this in a little more three-dimensionality. And then he talks about the different types of effects of magic, alteration of an existing substance, creation of a new substance, etc. And he talks about how there was meant to be a balance in the use of magic in the game, but that perhaps it got out of hand a little bit, and says that this is primarily at fault is the game itself, which does not carefully explain the reasoning behind the magic system. He then goes on to talk about the rationale behind the game balance and how magic users must rely upon their spells because they have virtually no weaponry or armor to protect them. Talks about the subject of new spells. There was an article earlier on that referred to the creation of spells and says the basic system allows for the players to create new spells for themselves at the option of the referee. And some final advice: magic is great, magic is powerful, but this means that it should be kept great and powerful in relation to the game environment. An ad for available supplemental material approved for use with D&D, AD&D, and with Traveler from the Judges Guild. We have a lengthy piece here on some miscellaneous treasure, weapons, artifacts, and monsters, etc. Advertisements for some minis, including this fellow right here. Doesn't seem to have anything better to do than to pick his nose. We have some fiction here. Which interesting here, this ad for the Dice Man Cometh, which is a dice dealer, and noticing here an ad for the new dice markers. As we know, the dice at the time were like this. This is a D10 contemporary to the time, and needed to be marked and inked like this one was. And there are an advertisement here for white, yellow, black, or red, waterproof, non-smudging, only 49 cents dice markers. There's an attempt at humor, or I guess maybe not an attempt, a humorous article on what to do when your dog eats your dice, or some other calamity befalls you 20 minutes before the game club gets to your place, and it is offering various methods for getting random numbers, essentially, if you do not have any appropriate dice to use, including this Maso Macho Delight, where all males with hirsute chests. Using the system, players snatch hairs from each other's chests, using the number of hairs as the number generated. There is more sort of fictional material, excerpt from an interview with a rust monster. Again, more ads for minis, 15mm fantasy armies. This is interesting. There is also by Gary Gygax here. It's mixing a World War II army with a troll army. D&D is a game of many facets, Gygax writes, and occasionally we cook up a few little surprises for the boys planning to play a straight battle. In this case, one team was carefully primed for an upcoming World War II minis game, while the other team was instructed regarding a fantasy battle to be fought on the tabletop. How could we mix moderns with swords and sorcery? The structure of D&D is such that it easily lends itself to such adaptation, and brief rules will be given at the end of the article. We've got orders of battle, situation analysis, and objectives given here for the German SS patrol, including grenades and rifles and the personnel, their situation and their objective ones, with some hiding place of guerrillas in a remote and wild area, which is accessible by means of a very old and rough car track. And then we have what are called the servants of the gatherer, who are waiting there. And these include magicians, mummies, ogres, ghouls, trolls, and they have axes, swords, and spears. And the explanation of where they were, and then a story of what actually happened here, the battle report of what happened, which is, it's pretty cool actually to read. I don't have the time to go through it all here, but there is a game and an analysis here. And the bottom line is, in this particular case, the servants of the gatherer triumphed, and there was an explanation of why they thought that was. And if you wish to play something out yourself, there is given to you some suggestions of how you might do that. There is, of course, an ad for TSR itself, with at least one thing here that I own, in addition to D&D, which is Divine Right. There are some variants here with spells for illusionists and what the illusionist actually can conjure and do, this type of a subclass of magic users who employ illusion. There are rules here for creating a random tomb and a crypt, and the treasures therein. And the discussion at the top says, the mystery, challenge, and pleasure of any wargamer in discovering and opening a tomb of some unknown being is well known to those that have done it. The creation of these tombs can be a very drawn out, head-scratching process for the judge, and the explanation of how to do the roll. It's fairly complicated. I tried to roll one up, and it's fairly complicated in terms of the percentage chance of the amount of things happening. It's quite detailed, but the concept is an interesting one. And moving outside of D&D, there are rules to place halflings, dwarves, clerics, and thieves into dungeon. That is the board game Dungeon. I didn't take my copy out. I have a more modern copy of that game. I don't know in my copy whether there are, I can't remember, it's been so long since I played it, whether there are any of these characters, but this is an addition to that board game. A very lengthy article on bards in play and what they can do, what their magical harps have, and various spells that they can weave, and an explanation of sort of what the amount of lore that they know, what this actually means in terms of their knowledge of legends and magic and such. There's the original Ranger class, an exciting new Dungeons and Dragons class, subcategory of fighting men, and explanations therein of what they can do and where they get advantages, and a lengthy supplemental article on research rules found in Men and Magic and how spells are attempted to be created, and manufacturing of scrolls and the duplication of magical items, the ways in which the wizards will work when attempting to create new magic, as well as a very lengthy witchcraft supplement for D&D. And it begins by saying, I guess it's uncredited actually as to who wrote this, its origins long since buried in the mists of time, the full story of witchcraft will never be told, but it is certain that it held deep roots even in the most humble and God-fearing of ancient communities. The legendary powers and most secret wisdoms of its members could make an interesting and lengthy addition to anyone's fantasy campaigns. And there is a discussion of specific magic and witchcraft and the types of spells that they might have, various aspects of it, priestess witchcraft, black witchcraft, what the major spells might be, and something about the kind of living situation and the secret orders of witches and what they do during the course of their lives. The secret witches occupy their long lives in the pursuit of power and usually will not trouble themselves to attack any creatures unless provoked. Still, they cannot tolerate intruders into their lair or interruptions in their endless experimenting. So anyone who stumbles into a secret order witch lair can expect big trouble. Further discussion of what these lairs are. Every witch owns a flying broom, but interestingly, outside of the lair, they will only be flying at 35% of the time. I did not know that. Talks about how the witch's lair is guarded with some type of a curse, and it discusses what those might be. Even good witch lairs have curses, and some explanation of what types of enchanted items may be in the witch lair. There is an ad here for the Gangster RPG from Fantasy Games Unlimited, and a discussion of all the different figurines and plans and supplements that there are. A discussion and illustration of monkish combat, of how a monk in D&D would actually fight physically, with a very lovely drawing of such. This is a reproduction of, even though it comes at the end here, this is a reproduction of something I've shown you in its own video, and you can see the link to that right here on solo Dungeons & Dragons adventures and how to map out a dungeon for yourself if you don't have a GM, perhaps to go through it and practice for what your campaign might be was the rationale behind it, I think, but it is a very early effort from the master, Gary Gygax, at creating a solo possibility for play. We have an article here on lycanthropy, the progress of the disease, and the lycanthrope experience. And finally, toward the end, we have some discussion of Japanese mythology, and Japanese mythology is a mixture of Buddhism and Shinto, and what some of the spells and the gods from that mythology would be. And finally, there is a discussion here in the end of random monsters. And he says, no, I don't mean wandering monsters, I mean random monsters. One of the problems with D&D is that the players always know too much. And the answer is occasionally throw a monster at the party that keeps them on their toes, one they have never seen before. No rules cover it, so they have to find out the hard way what it's like. Well, how do you do that? By taking the following tables and rolling dice. Just work your way through the tables one by one, and you will end up with a guaranteed original unknown random monster. And you start out by rolling for intelligence, alignment, the type that it could be, a mammal, a reptile, or an undead, its speed, armor, hit class, etc. And then there are some special characteristics that you can roll up. And for example, a mammal could be hostile to a certain group, or only silver or magic weapons would be effective against. The reptiles could have a paralysis touch, or the undead, for example, could be destroyed by running water, or could be a charming undead. And then there are some other characteristics, no head, 3 eyes, 4 eyes, etc. So again, very early on, I mean, this seems almost obvious to us in the sense of rule sets today giving rules for creating a random monster, but very, very early on in the history of D&D, this was provided. This to create a specific type of demon, if you want, with some, again, more random tables for what the different level demons could do. There is an advertisement for the Complete Strategist Wargame Headquarters at 11 East 33rd Street, New York, New York, 10016, phone number 212-685-3880. This remains there today, and as you can see, their phone number has remained unchanged all these years. The magazine ends with an ad for Space Gamer magazine, and this is somewhat of a parallel in a way to what we've got here, and it's from Metagaming, and I will perhaps be showing you some of that magazine at some point in the future. So there is a look inside the Best of the Dragon volumes volume 1 of that collection, which contains the strategic review and from Dragon volumes 1 and 2. You can let me know in the comments if you would be interested in seeing more page throughs of, as I said, I have the complete set of these published books. They run to 5 different volumes running through the Dragon up through 1986.